Hello and welcome. This is Jim Carp. I've got Jennifer, Mark, as well as Jessica, and we're going to be talking incident response. Folks, introduce yourself here real quick and we'll get started.
Hi, Jim. This is Jennifer Poplava, and I'm an attorney at the Grand Rapids law firm of Mika, Meyers.
Afternoon, Jim. Mark Spock, Director of Security and Support Services with Rehmann Technology Solutions.
Hi, Jim. Jessica Dory. I'm a principal in charge of technology risk management at Rehmann.
Okay, so an old adage is that it's time to plan before you have an incident. So, Mark, you've been involved in quite a few of these different areas. What do you do if you have a breach?
Well, I'll tell you what, definitely right out of the gate, there's a few key telephone calls that you want to make. And, first one, hopefully your first call is to Rehmann. Rehmann Technology Solutions, we are here to assist you in any type of breach activity that you may deal with or an incident. But there certainly is some other phone calls that you should be making as well at the same time. And I'm sure Jennifer and Jessica would love to speak to that.
Yes, of course, your call should also be made to your attorney. You want to loop them in early so that they can communicate with vendors to help preserve privilege in the communications and the investigation that will protect any information that you discover from being obtained by someone else. And also you will have an attorney analyze what legal requirements you might have to notify others about the breach. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. But usually if clients call me first, I send them to people like Mark, because Mark's going to be on the team that helps stop the intrusion, but you do want to have your attorney in one of those first few phone calls.
And then Jessica, also there's another phone call that needs to be made as well, and that is to?
Yeah, a couple other ones, Jim. So insurance agents. So if you do have a cyber liability policy, you're going to want to call your insurance agent because they may mandate a recovery vendor or a forensics vendor to get your claim paid for this. So you're going to definitely want to call that insurance agent, figure out what your policy is, and if there are any specific vendors that have to be utilized for recovery. Also, from a consideration, consider writing Rehmann in. So when you're negotiating these policies, consider writing Rehmann into your cyber liability policy as your recovery partner. Because we are able to assist organizations in these incidents that happen. Another call would be to your PR or your communications firm. In the event that you do experience a breach, it's very important that you have a PR or communications firm involved so that they can properly communicate the necessary information. So if you have any PII, personally identifiable information, or any HIPAA or PCI data involved, it's going to be very important that it's appropriately communicated, and your PR communication firm can help with that. Also, there's a lot of state laws regarding notification requirements, so you want to make sure that you have covered those. And also, you want to be very careful in your communications. You don't want to inform the enemy, aka the hacker who's compromising your system, in a press release, like who you're working with or how much insurance you have, or those types of things. So you don't want to give out any of that sensitive information in very public releases. So that's, again, where your PR communications firm can help you and direct you in what information should be communicated and how it should be properly communicated.
Jennifer, there's breach notifications. Can you share some insights on that?
Sure thing. This stage of incident response typically happens after you've had a chance to get your system back online. You've made sure that the hacker has been ejected and the intrusion has stopped. You will want to have your IT company do a forensic review of what happened, so that you will be able to tell how someone got access, what they accessed, and whether or not they were able to exfiltrate any of the information. Which means, did they basically take information out of your system so that it could be placed somewhere else? The reason that analysis is important and is information that an attorney will need is that there are 50 state breach notification statutes that require that, depending on where the resident or the individual who the information pertains to is located, you have to provide notice of what happened with the breach under certain circumstances. And it's a very complicated analysis, and it's very time consuming, and it's not always required. So, for example, many of the state statutes do not require that you provide notice of a breach where your forensic investigation shows that the information may have been accessed but wasn't actually exfiltrated, or if you're able to conclude that there's no reasonable chance of harm to the individuals whose information was part of the corrupted system. So you can't make those determinations without having the forensic review providing that information to you, but it is something that you need to have in order to make that determination. And it's really important that you go through that analysis, because if it turns out that you were required to provide notice to individuals related to this breach and you don't do that, there are fines. And in some states, there are quite high fines. And also, there are some statutes in some states that will basically put you under watch. They'll start to monitor you, and they'll require that you change your processes. For example, the Federal Trade Commission has gotten involved in a number of breach cases saying, hey, we think that you didn't actually take reasonable security precautions, so we're going to keep an eye on you for a while to make sure that you're changing your practices and that you're doing the things that you need to do to protect things in the future, and we're also going to slap you with this fine. So it's important that you actually do try to comply with these laws so that you can avoid that kind of business, because frankly, some businesses can't bear the weight of complying with providing all these notices to people in addition to the administrative fees if they haven't planned for it in advance.
Gotcha. Okay. So we know that we need to make these calls initially. We got to have be prepared for a breach notification. So Mark, when they call a provider like you, what is the response team? How's it all fit together? And then what are the basic components for a good, solid incident response plan?
Yeah, you bet. I mean, we obviously at Rehmann, we want to be your first telephone call. If we can support you in these situations, we do have an internal process and a procedure that we follow that will help walk clients through what really amounts to be probably one of the most stressful situations a business or a business owner can walk through. And so, what you really want to think about ahead of time is maybe looking at having some agreements in place ahead of time. Because oftentimes when these situations hit, they come on very fast and furious. There's a lot of stress. There's a lot of different things and factors that are going on. So it's very important to maybe take the step of making sure that you have kind of what we like to call a break glass agreement in place. In case of emergency, here's what's going to happen. And that agreement really kind of aims to set the limits of authorization. It allows us as a recovery partner to act very quickly. We don't have to take that time to iron out what do we get to do and what is the billing rate, and all of that negotiation. You really don't want to be doing that at the time that the incident has started or has been determined. You really want to have that stuff ahead of time. So it kind of feels a little bit like a retainer, but it will make sure that we speed up our response and things flow very smoothly. When we talk about building a solid IR plan, internally, Rehmann does have an IR plan that we follow, and we use that in our client responses. But really, if you think about building your own internal IR plan, there are a few basic tenets that I like to touch on just very quickly. Really, it kind of starts with really understanding your business. And this is really a comprehensive sit down to understand what makes your business tick. What are all the applications, the processes, the procedures that actually make up the product and or services that you deliver to your customers? And when you begin to understand those systems, you begin to lay them out and understand their level of importance and criticality to the business. Because certainly there's going to be applications, there's going to be services that you have within your company that you could probably live without for a couple of days. But there's others that if they're down for an extended period of time, is very impactful to the business. So really the first step is what I like to call reviewing your company's operations. And this is really to sit down and really get a full holistic understanding of how your business runs, what makes it tick, and we document all those things really, really well. Then we want to take the step of really going through and really identifying any potential issues that might be within the environment. There's probably always some things that we're actively working on as a business to improve or fix, or we want to continue to upgrade or move forward. We do want to identify any potential issues that we know about in the environment so that we're factoring those things into our incident response plan. We don't want to leave that stuff off to the side. This is a very honest review of your business. You want to be very thorough and very honest because it's going to make the IR plan much more actionable. Incident response, it's a team sport. You're going to have to involve a lot of people in the process. There's really no way to do this in a vacuum. You really have to pull other parties in from the business and have that conversation and help understand from their perspective what's important to them. Just because you as an IT individual may determine that a particular application has a certain level of criticality, when you actually sit down and talk with that particular department manager, you may get a completely different story and a completely different picture about how you have to factor in that system. So make sure that you are definitely pulling everyone in. And then really the next one is developing your metrics and severities. So part of your IR plan is really determining when do things need to happen? When do they need to be back in place? How quickly can we get there? This may also apply to your response partners that you use. So for example, with Rehmann, you may have some determination that, you know what, we need Rehmann to respond within 4 hours of an incident occurring, and that we've made X amount of progress within this amount of time. And that you may want to do the same thing with other partners, other vendors. We have a lot of SaaS-based applications today. A lot of our data operations are decentralized. We're using a lot of things that are third-party applications. And so we have to have those lines of communication and set those expectations for their involvement in your recovery process. And so identifying what those metrics and what those severities are is going to make sure that you're working off of a very accurate plan. You always want to have your action plans ready to go. You know, one of the big things that I find quite often is when I walk into these incidences, many of them in many cases have been ransomware attacks. If you have an incident response plan, or you have a disaster recovery plan, or you do have a business continuity plan, but it was stored on your file server that's now encrypted, how are you going to get to work on that plan? What is the first step you're going to take? Do you remember what you need to do? That's a very tough situation to be in. So we want to use the technologies that are available to us. Let's make sure that we have an offline copy of that plan. Even if we have to have good old-fashioned paper copy, we want to make sure that we have an offline copy of that plan to pull it out and know exactly what we're going to do in the order we need to do it in. The next piece is really important, is it's really a testing and updating that plan. We want to make sure over time that we are taking that plan through iterations, and we're doing like kind of what we call tabletop testing. And it's really sitting down and drafting a scenario and walking the business through that particular scenario and testing the different tenets of the plan and say, did we find gaps? Did we find places where maybe the plan didn't address or didn't resolve the issue that we thought it was going to address? And so we want to take that plan through that testing and updating cycle. What we learn in that testing and updating should feed back into the development process, and we make sure that we are always cultivating that plan to be as accurate as we possibly can. Your incident response plan should also include your disaster recovery plan. When I walk into these incidences and they are very stressful situations, you really want to have that plan laid out of what is my recovery process? What is my recovery procedure? What is the order in which I need to do it in to restore my business operations? So if you don't have a disaster recovery plan today, I would encourage you to make that investment. If you need some coaching on how to get started with that, Rehmann is happy to help in that regard. But make sure that you're feeding that disaster recovery plan back into the process. And then also involve other business units as needed. You may have to run this plan through multiple departments, have them look at it. They may even be part of your tabletop testing, just to make sure that everybody's in agreement so they know what's going to happen if an incident were to ever occur. And then lastly, like I mentioned previously in the testing and updating phase, is its lessons learned. If you do walk through one of those incidences, you want to take what you've learned from that particular situation and you want to feed it back into the process. We always want it to be iterative. We want that plan to constantly be evolving and dynamic, and it's always becoming more accurate every time we use it. So that's really kind of the basic tenets of an IR plan. Back to you, Jim.
Okay, so you mentioned disaster recovery plans. How important are they, and how can you benefit from them?
You bet. So the disaster recovery plan is really your recovery playbook. It really determines what you're going to do, who is going to do it, and the order that you're going to do it in based upon the criticality of that operation to the business. This is a culmination of all of these discussions that we've had. And often what we like to see is what we call a business impact analysis, where we actually sit down and we understand the importance of each one of the services that we provide either to our internal clients or our external clients. We want to understand how important those applications are. We're going to rank them. We're going to put them in order. That disaster recovery plan is really going to start building the tenets of understanding what we're going to do, how we're going to do it, and who's going to be involved to do it. And you really want to create that plan in advance. It's kind of the old adage, Jim, failure to plan is planning to fail. So we want to make sure that we have that plan in advance, and we want to make sure, again, that plan is available off-site. If you have a solid plan and you get ransomware and you can't get to your plan, it makes it very difficult for the recovery process. And I will tell you, I've walked through a number of these incidences with clients, and I'll tell you what, ad hoc recovery, it is very painful. It is very difficult. It is stressful. And it's really quite hard to actually give confident updates to upstream stakeholders. You may need to be reporting up to different levels to say, where are we at in the recovery process? How close are we? When will these systems be back online? Well, if you don't have the disaster recovery plan, you can't estimate and understand where you are, especially if we've not done any testing, because then we have no real understanding of what it's really going to take to get to that finish line. Okay. So really from that standpoint, one of the things that's also tricky here is that we also have to take into account our insurance policy and our cyber liability policy. And, Jennifer, I'm gonna let you jump in and kind of talk about this a little bit, because it has some impact when we're actually talking about recovery.
It absolutely does. As someone mentioned, I believe it was Jessica at the beginning of our conversation, your insurance policy may instruct you to use certain providers in both your recovery and your forensic investigation efforts. So it's important to know that immediately so that you can be sure that all of your expenses are recoverable. It's also extremely important to understand what coverage you have, because most general coverage insurance policies do not include the type of cyber coverage that you need in order to respond to a breach. Many of them have a very low cap, or they just don't include the type of services that you're going to need when you're responding. Typically, you will need to request either a separate policy or a separate schedule or rider that specifically addresses cyber liability. And that policy will include things like coverage for recovery. So amounts paid to Rehmann, for example. It will also include legal expenses, so amounts paid to someone like Mika Meyers, who's analyzing whether you need to provide notifications. Those policies will also include the cost of providing notifications in many instances. So whether you are contracting with a third party that might be a call center or someone that handles all of the mailings that you may need to send out, a good cyber liability policy will cover that as well. And it will also cover more traditional expenses like business interruption, or if you have damage to your system from the intrusion. Finally, some of these cyber liability policies also cover part of ransomware payments. I generally advise my clients not to pay ransomware unless it is a last resort. However, sometimes that last resort actually presents itself and you can't restore because you haven't prepared in advance, and you may find yourself in a position where you need to pay the ransom to get your information back so that you can become operational. A cyber liability policy will include a line item for ransomware if it's well drafted. So Insurance policies are extremely boring and complicated and difficult to review, and yet it is very important that you do look through your policy documents, not just the front page that tells you the levels, but the actual policy document that tells you what your coverage might be.
That was awesome, Jennifer. And, one of the things that I, always like to mention in this is that we have so many different things that are involved from an incident response perspective, our disaster recovery efforts. We've got insurance involved. We've got attorneys involved. Is we really want to stop when we're all done, when we've been recovered, we've gotten back into operation. We really want to review what happened. We want to understand the outcome. We want to understand what went well. We want to understand what didn't go well. We want to understand how did our partners respond? Did they respond the way that our incident response plan intended them to respond? How was our interaction with the insurance company? How was our interaction with our attorney or our breach notification attorney? So it's very important that we have all of these conversations when we're done, because we want to feed that back into the refinement process of the plans and make sure that we make account for the changes that need to be made.
Okay, thank you, folks. Throughout this series, our goal is to first talk about how do you make sure that you're safe if you're working remotely. And we went through the technical as well as the administrative and legal aspects associated with it. We then focused in on setting up the policies to make sure that everything's all buttoned down for you. And then as well as today, now we've talked about the incident response. So, Jennifer, what's the best way if somebody has additional questions for you to get a hold of you?
I can be reached at 616-632-8050, which is my direct dial, or you can visit my firm's website at MikaMeyers.com, and my email and all of my other contact information is available on that site.
Mark, for you, best way to reach out.
You bet, Jim. You can reach me at 616-301-6447. Email is also great as well. You can reach me at mark.spaak, that's S-P-A-A-K, at Rehmann.com. That's spelled REHMANN.com.
Jessica.
You can reach me at 989-797-8391 or via email at jessica.dory, JESSICA.DORE at Rehmann, REHMANN.com. Thanks,
Great.
Jim.
Yep. Great public service here, folks. Thank you for the insights. We'll enjoy talking to you in the future. Take care now.